Hello, so we are here to look at our final recording, although not our final exchange. And in this recording, I want to share some basic elements that I think it's important to consider when looking at gender-based violence, when we discuss gender-based violence within the field of development projects, but also with the aim of educating about it. So the contents of this lecture will be, first of all, trying to understand the meaning of gender-based violence, its scope, quickly getting an idea of some international agreements that define it and the position about it. Then we will look at ways of preventing and educating about gender-based violence, so preventing it before for it not to happen, and then educating as well about what it is so as to avoid gender-based violence taking place, but also educating about what the different types of violence could be so that the person that is suffering can identify them while this person is suffering these types of violence. We will also look at the case of Argentina, learn a little bit about how it has been its struggle, specifically in the recent years against gender-based violence, and the role that different actors have played in its struggle against gender-based violence. We have on the one hand the role of the feminist movement, the role of international development initiatives, and the role of national and subnational policies addressing gender-based violence. We will finalize by looking at some of the challenges that we face in Argentina in this domain. But the idea is that you can also extrapolate some of the reflections we make about this topic in the case of Argentina to other contexts. Okay, so international agreements, the most important one internationally is one called CEDAW, that it's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women. This is a human rights treaty, which means that if a state ratifies this treaty, the state has to take all necessary measures to ensure that the rights that are included in this convention are also included in national laws and are responsibilities the state has to monitor. So when you ratify a convention, it's not you just ratify the convention, but you as a state have the responsibility to ensure that you make all necessary national and subnational changes to ensure that the contents of these rights are respected in your country through the law and through following on public policies necessary to implement laws. One important element that I have highlighted about this convention is the fact that as from then onwards, many of the definitions and responsibilities given to the state become paramount because the convention has the spirit of clearly marking that violence, whether it happens in the domestic sphere or whether it happens in any private sphere, it's not a private issue. It is a public responsibility. So if there's a country or there's a woman killed or a woman beaten up or anything, any type of violence, this is responsibility of the state. So aside from the fact that that family can take that person to court, etc., the state has the responsibility in the first place to is guilty for having had that case happening in its country and for not having enough measures to prevent this type of violences, and is also responsible to doing correct reparation, etc. No? So it's considered like a crime that it's responsibility of the state. Then we have the Belém do Pará agreement. This is a Latin American agreement mainly because it comes from the Inter-American Convention. It's the Inter-American Convention, sorry, on the prevention and punishment, eradication of all forms of violence against women. Comes 10 years later. You can check it also. It's in different languages. But as a country, if you are Argentina, Brazil, any of the countries within the Inter-American human rights system, if you also ratify this convention, you are responsible to endorsing its contents. You have then other type of agreements. These two that come after this one that I am including in this slide are more from the development sector. No? So you have more the other ones that were more human rights mechanisms. And these two, you have the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a revision of the Millennium Development Goals. And if, as a country, when you are within the system trying to reach with other countries the Sustainable Development Goals, you also have responsibilities of carrying out measures that allow you to achieve those goals. As you might remember, there are some goals that are specific to gender equity, Sustainable Development Goal 5, but there's also other goals that very much have to do with it. So as a country, you have to show in your reports what you are doing in order to achieve those goals and the specific targets that are stated in those goals. So types of violence, this is an important aspect. I'm using here mainly the Latin American way of identifying types of violence, which follows also very much on the international and regional agreements. You have on the one hand the physical violence, which is perhaps the more easier one to imagine. That's the definition. You can read it afterwards in the PowerPoint. I don't want to repeat it all. Then you have sexual type of violence. You have psychological type of violence, which is perhaps more subtle and more difficult to identify. And it's about the emotional damage that it's being done to women, girls, because of their gender and the impacts it has on its self-esteem. Then you have economic, and I would say economic violence. Perhaps the other word is a bit of a Spanglish word, which is violence that has to do with not allowing women to fully exercise their economic rights, to fully be in control of money, be in control of their possessions. And then there's another type of violence, which is the symbolic violence, that is also perhaps a little bit more subtle than the other ones, but it's very important. You might be aware of it also in the United States. It's about using stereotyped messages that reproduce domination or a domination of men over women, but also they reproduce negative images of women. Where there's different places, forms of violence where this can take place, the ones that I mentioned. It can be at the domestic sphere, it's a family group, it can be at an institutional place, then it can be obstetric, which is sometimes related also to institutional, and it's mainly related to violence that occurs in health systems. There can be violence at the workplace, and there can be violence of reproduction, so it is also related to the within the area of health, and it is that violence that does not allow a woman to decide freely on issues related with her reproduction. And then there's the media form of violence, which for example, when we were mentioning the symbolic violence and the messages that reproduce certain negative stereotypes about women, this is typically found within media. Okay, just so that we don't lose the dimension of what we're talking about and why it's so serious and important to discuss it, it's estimated from sources from different United Nations agencies that 30% of women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual partner violence. So when you look at the numbers in this slide, or you also look at more detailed reports, there is also alarming numbers in terms of female genital mutilation as another type of violence that, well, it does not take place in South American countries, but it is present in other global South countries, and for that reason, it is one of the areas of concern for many of the development strategies nowadays, trying to reduce violence. And there is the still very worrying numbers of the killing of women by intimate partners or family members, what we call in Argentina, in Latin America, but also in English, femicide. Okay, so the term femicide, so that you have a little bit of background, it's important to understand that it has not always been there, and it has in itself a very political objective, which is exactly showing that women are often killed by things that are related with female subordination in patriarchal societies. And this has been purposely used, the term femicide, so as to distinguish killings that are not necessarily just common criminal killings, but that have to do with certain social tragedy that makes men believe that women are their property and lead some of the most to some very extreme actions of violence, which end up in femicide. So if you are interested in going deeper into the topic, it's important for you to take into account that it's not just a term that it's randomly called like that just because, but it wants to ensure that this term is there so as to make also states responsible for reducing this gender type of killings. There's other type of violence that it's very much discussed in South America nowadays, which is care. Care work, not as violence itself, but the fact that it is in most of Latin American societies, all type of care work, it's still done by families, and within families, it is heavily done by women, and care is often made invisible of what it is, the contributions it makes to the lives of the families and to the well-being of human beings. And the idea is to ensure that also you will see in the Sustainable Development Goals that this unfair distribution of care work is addressed, because not addressing it means that women have worse quality of life, they have less time to do other better recognized jobs in the labor market. They have less time for leisure. And what it's worse, socially in a patriarchal society, we tend to reproduce a system of living in which women are constantly overburdened in their position as caregivers. Okay, so having identified all these type of possible violence and places where it can take place, we can discuss now the type of preventions that there is. There's what it's called primary prevention, which is interventions that work with individual or communities, irrespective on whether they have suffered violence or not. And this is very much the request that is done to educational institutions nowadays to ensure that anything patriarchal leading to violence is addressed. This would be primary prevention. Then you have interventions that are of a secondary type of prevention, which is targeting at women that have experienced violence already and trying to ensure they do not experience it again, and there's not a re-victimization, or even ensuring that male perpetrators are not in a position to do this again. Another very important area of work that it's gaining more popularity, I think, in many places around the world, but particularly in Latin America, is working with masculinities. So this is trying to ensure that there's not only work done to discuss what is gender-based violence, like in a more abstract way, or there's not only work being done for women or girls to identify violence, but it's also important work of deconstructing masculinity type of models that lead to certain behavior on side of men that can be violent. So in Argentina, it would mean deconstructing what is the model of a man, what is celebrated as a socially for a man, for men more generally, and going from there, trying to deconstruct all the potential violences that there is in this stereotype construction of what men are supposed to be, what a successful man is, and what women are. So there's a lot of work that it's now innovative. It's not yet being carried out all over educational places, or neither schools nor universities, but increasingly there is some groups of activists that are trying to question the masculinity model that leads to violence in the end. So as I was saying, in these activist groups that are sometimes can be part of an NGO or can be part of just informal networks, the idea is to revise the way that certain male chauvinist concepts are feeding the existence of violence. They can also be this type of reviewing, and what we are usually calling nowadays, the term is trying to bring down toxic type of masculinities and build on healthy type of masculinities that would lead us to societies free of violence. So to end up the presentation that I hope that we can continue discussing when we meet on Wednesday. In the case of Argentina, what has been the situation in combating and reducing gender-based violence. First of all, as I have explained in other discussions we had, the role of the feminist movement was very important, has been very important. First in 2015, when there was certain femicides that shocked the society, lots of women went out the streets to claim to the state for justice and to stop having this kind of femicides in the future. This has the role of the feminist movement has been very important in putting pressure to the state to comply with international agreements about reducing gender-based violence. There has also been a lot of pressure on side of the feminist movement to advance with more freedom in terms of sexual reproductive rights. As I mentioned in a previous lecture, 1 year ago, the abortion was made legal, and this to a large extent has been the result of a lot of pressure coming from the feminist movement. So, as I was also anticipating in another lecture, all these advances have been positive, but at the same time have produced certain conservative reactions, which have not made the path towards reducing gender-based violence that linear, no? In this sense, and returning back to what the development aid sector can do to help countries reduce gender-based violence, well, we have all these agreements, the ones on human rights treaties, then the Sustainable Development Goals that are have specific targets on different aspects. One of them is violence, but there's also financial collaboration, for example, and technical collaboration. As I was explaining at another moment, I am personally now involved. I am working for the Spotlight Initiative in Argentina, which is a global alliance between agencies of the United Nations and the European Union, aimed at reducing violence all over the world, but basically with focus on global South countries. And it has chosen some specific countries to support financially in different ways. One of the countries that it has supported has been Argentina. Since 2019, it has been supporting Argentina with different actions carried out by both the government and civil society organizations. So here we are discussing a development aid collaboration, which is financial, but which is also carried out through the technical expertise of different agencies that support it within the United Nations, and also with the expertise of the European Union offices. Then there has been other important, let's say, contributions to advancing women's rights in Argentina. One is the ILO Convention aimed at reducing gender-based violence at work. And this convention has been taken by Argentina also approximately 2 years ago, and Argentina in that sense has been one of the first countries to adopt this convention. And adopting this ILO convention means also that the country will take very seriously how to address gender-based violence at the workplace, but also how to treat the women that suffer violence at their domestic spheres, and how to ensure they get proper assistance at the workplace when they have been victims of domestic violence at home. So this is also a way that the development aid sector or international bilateral or multilateral organizations in this case have been able to support and advance with efforts aimed at reducing gender-based violence. This, in the last years, there has been, with the current government nowadays, but also there were some measures in the previous government, more and more efforts to ensure that there's an institutionality addressing gender inequity. So for the first time in Argentina in 2019, we get a ministry that you see there, Ministerio de las Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidad, a ministry focused on diversity and women and gender, yeah? So efforts have gone there, but also in in provinces of the country to ensure that some institutions that were working with the agenda of gender have a higher support and get a higher institutional rank in doing this. There has also been increasing support to phone lines, ensuring that they are accessible to women that are victims of domestic violence or other types of violence. There have been also a specific line, for example, set up in the province of Buenos Aires, which is called Hablemos, which is aimed at helping or listening or accompanying cases of men that have been violent. So as you can see, increasingly the approach is to focus on the whole picture, no? Not just the victims, but the ones that make the victims. And there has been, in line with what I was saying, more efforts to educate about violence. For example, there's this very important law that it's called Ley Micaela. It's as an homage to a girl that was killed, also a femicide. And this law makes it compulsory for anybody in a public position to have it, to receive basic education about gender equity and obviously gender-based violence. So 2 years ago, this law was passed, and this means that if you are working in the court, if you are working as a state public officer somewhere, or even in different educational institutions, you must have this course compulsory. It's not a choice. You must follow these courses with basic contents about gender equity. Then we have also had important and interesting advances on the side of educational institutions, but one of them, for example, is the Institute of Masculinities and Social Change, that it's an NGO, but that works also closely with different state agencies, so as to promote different types of masculinities, as I was explaining before, trying to ensure that we go deep in cultural changes that lead towards violence. And in order to do so, you need to promote new ways and new models of healthy masculinities. This has been an important effort. Then there has been the Ministry of one of the ministries of tourism, culture and sport in Argentina has advanced a lot in collaboration also with some NGOs in ensuring that there is education within sports, either in any kind of sports, about what is sexual abuse, about preventing sexual abuse, about ensuring that women and girls are not discriminated at sport. So there has been also tools developed so that a club, a football club, or any informal place where young children are educated has the possibility to identify and prevent violence from happening in also in these more informal settings. So current challenges, sorry, I missed the G, I will change it. As I was saying, there's the conservative reactions, sometimes religious reactions that are in tension with some of the advances, with some of these more innovative policies that are trying to be carried out. So this is the other side of the coin, as some try to advance with a more progressive and open-minded views. Sometimes some groups, for example, those ones working with new masculinities, get serious attacks from religious groups. No? So this is a challenge, but it's part of, it's not only happening in Argentina, it's happening in different countries that are advancing with certain rights. The other side of the coin is that there will be some tension until certain rights are really a conquest. Another challenge, sorry, I missed some letters there, is the fact that we still lack in Argentina, but not only in many countries, very more solid ways of measuring gender-based violence. And this is important because you need to have proper registries and common understandings nationally of what are the cases, what are the numbers of femicides, for example. Also, it's important to have a good geographical identification of where certain femicides occur the most, so as to be able to develop proper public policies to address it. So the fact of sometimes not having totally solid data is important, and this is also something that international development agencies are always trying to support, no? To measure well violence and other aspects that are an obstacle to development, to the society's development, to measure them well so as to be able to monitor progress and eliminate it. Then we have had obviously the challenge of the pandemic, which has meant not only for Argentina, but for many countries, because of these periods of isolation in which people could not leave their houses, there has been increased levels of violence in some provinces of the country. There has been increased levels of femicide, part of violence generally that has been recorded by services that have been called more frequently throughout this period. The positive note on this is that usually when a country progresses with reducing gender-based violence, there is usually more use of certain services because there's more awareness about it. So sometimes it's difficult to read whether a country is progressing or not in reducing violence, because sometimes the immediate reaction when you teach more about it is that you have more cases because more people are aware of it, more people identify that they are victims of gender-based violence. Another big challenge that I think, because of the essays that I have been reading and the things that you are interested in, my students of this semester, is intersectionalities, no? The different discriminations that can affect certain women that are not only women, but may be part of an indigenous community, or they may have certain disabilities. So a challenge that is still very much discussed in the different governmental spaces that I've attended to is how to ensure that the services are well designed to reach these women that are suffering multiple vulnerabilities. So there we are also facing big problems in terms of how to ensuring that the messages reach them properly, culturally, but also sometimes there's some of these women living in very remote areas. So services and their needs have to be adapted so as to ensure that the approach the whole effort of reducing gender-based violence also reaches them. No? So here again, a lot of food for thought to think about how to adapt some general ideas about reducing gender-based violence to the realities of women that suffer multiple violences and are not urban or white, and they live in different places of the country and have different needs. This is something that I can clearly speak for the case of Argentina, but relates to many global southern countries and also in the north. Okay, this is all for now. Look forward to see you on Wednesday.